farmer's horse collapsed into soft earth, and when he dug beneath the surface, the ground split open like it was giving back what it had tried to hide. Inside the wooden chest lay bones, children's bones, some broken, some bound, all silent. Their skulls still carried the dents of human cruelty. The year was 1829, the place a borderland between Maryland and Delaware. But what was uncovered that spring wasn't just murder. It was an entire system of disappearance, run not by an army, not by a man, but by a woman named Patty Cannon, a name so feared that even newspapers of her time wrote it with trembling restraint. For nearly 2 decades, this woman ran what history now calls the Reverse Underground Railroad, a secret network that kidnapped free black men, women, and children and sold them into slavery in the Deep South. But what few know is that this wasn't merely about money. It was about power, a female architect of control and terror who turned borders, laws, and race itself into weapons. Imagine the psychology of such a woman, standing at her tavern's door at midnight, holding a lantern while wagons rolled in heavy with bound captives. She didn't look away. She counted them. To her, human life was just another form of currency, and the screams from the cellar were the sound of commerce. But what made her story truly forbidden is not just the blood she spilled, it's how she got away with it. For 20 years, her crimes existed in plain sight, protected by bureaucrats, sheriffs, and judges who all claimed jurisdiction didn't apply. The system itself bent to her will, a shadow government of silence that covered her atrocities. And here's the question no historian wants to answer. How many like her still exist? How many systems of control still feed on the bodies of the powerless while the world calls it order? Tu nicht you note here for entertainment. You're here to remember what power does when no one dares to stop it. Welcome to the true story of Patty Cannon, the woman who hunted and killed Afrikaner Americans. Before she became the nightmare of the Eastern Shore, Patty Cannon was invisible. Born around 1760, perhaps in Canada, perhaps in Pennsylvania, her origins were deliberately obscured. Even her real name is uncertain. Some records Vispa Lucrezia Patricia Henley. Others call her Martha Cannon. But what's clear is that she built herself from secrecy. She understood, even then, that the less the world knew, the more power she could command. She arrived in the borderlands between Delaware and Maryland around 1790, a region of marshes and pine woods where the soil swallowed footsteps and the law was only as strong as the man who could enforce it. There she married a farmer, Jesse Cannon, quiet, mild, hard-working, the kind of man the world forgets. They had land that straddled both states, and a modest 2-story home that would one day become her fortress of captivity. Neighbors described her as large, strong, rough in manner. She was a 6-foot presence in a world where women rarely reached 5. Her voice was low and commanding, the kind of voice that made men listen even when they didn't want to. When her husband died, some say from poison, she inherited not just his land, but his legitimacy. Now she could operate under the perfect disguise, a widow, a tavern keeper, a matron, the kind society ignored until it was too late. The early 1800s were a time of desperation and profit. The international slave trade had been banned, but the demand for enslaved labor had exploded. Cotton, sugar, tobacco, the lifeblood of the new empire all demanded more hands. That vacuum birthed monsters. It was the perfect economy for evil, and Patty Cannon understood supply and demand better than any banker on Wall Street. She learned that freedom itself had a price. Free African Americans, men and women who had escaped bondage or been born outside it, were the soft targets of a system that didn't see them as human. Their papers could be stolen, their names erased, their bodies sold south under new identities. No one came looking. No one came looking. No one cared. And from that indifference, Patty built an empire. She turned her farmhouse into a maze of secret rooms and hidden cellars, places no lawman would search, because no lawman cared to. By the dawn of the 19th century, Patty Cannon had mastered her disguise. To the travelers who passed through the wooded roads near Johnson's Crossroads, she was merely a stern widow running a tavern, a place of ale, bread, and passing gossip. But beneath that roof, something older and colder was taking shape, a machine of human commerce that would eventually span from Pennsylvania to the Mississippi Delta. Her transformation began through her daughters, both married men who were not farmers, not merchants, but hunters, not of animals, but of people. The first was Henry Brereton, a blacksmith by trade, but a kidnapper by profit. He knew the value of muscle and secrecy. With Patty's guidance, He learned the darker craft, how to read a man's desperation, how to promise work and deliver chains. He began scouting free black families in Maryland and Delaware, noting who had papers, who didn't, who would be missed, and who wouldn't. These were not random victims. They were chosen. Under the illusion of employment or debt collection, Brereton would lure them to remote paths, where Patty's men waited. They'd be subdued, gagged, and carried to the Cannon homestead, the same walls where Jesse Cannon once slept in peace, now echoing with the sound of iron and muffled cries. When Brereton was caught in 1811, imprisoned for kidnapping, he escaped within the year, and blood quickly followed. The first documented killing tied to Patty's family occurred soon after. A rival slave trader, Rigdale, came to her tavern carrying thousands in cash. He was found dead, shot through the chest, his money gone, his slaves vanished. His body was buried in Patty's field, the same field that years later would give up its dead when the farmer's horse broke through the soil. Her son-in-law was captured and hanged for the murder in 1813. But Patty? She escaped untouched. No witnesses dared speak against her. The community, silent and complicit, turned away, for she was white, female, and ruthless enough to make fear itself her shield. It was that moment, the first blood, the first silence, that transformed her tavern into something unholy. It was no longer a business. It was a border between two worlds, the lawful and the lawless, the living and the forgotten. From that point forward, Patty Cannon no longer concealed her power. She embodied it. When her daughter remarried, the story of Patty Cannon entered its darkest phase. The new husband was Joseph Johnson, a man of calculation rather than temper, the kind who knew how to make crime look like commerce. He wasn't a brute, he was a strategist. And together, he and Patty would create something that would come to be known as the Reverse Underground Railroad, a hidden pipeline of human theft and psychological control that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Johnson owned a tavern that sat exactly on the Maryland-Delaware border, so precisely divided that one half of the building was under one state's jurisdiction and the other half under another's. A legal trick. When lawmen from Delaware came with a warrant, a suspect could simply walk across the room and claim immunity. What they built there was genius in its evil, a labyrinth designed to confuse the law, conceal the victims, and convert flesh into fortune. The upper floors were a facade, tables, chairs, music, candles, and laughter. But below, hidden behind concealed trapdoors, were cells, low ceilings, iron rings bolted into stone, small air vents drilled to keep captives alive long enough to sell. The smell of damp wood and sweat must have been unbearable. But that's what made the tavern profitable, endurance before the exchange. This wasn't just kidnapping, it was industrialized disappearance. Johnson managed the logistics wagons, routes, and burs in the Dapsaus. That he enforced silence, through intimidation, through murder, through the raw dominance of her presence. Together, they turned a border tavern into an invisible port, where the human trade flowed north to south, reversed like a river of stolen souls. But what made it work wasn't their cunning alone. It was the complicity of everyone around them. Merchants sold them supplies, neighbors looked away. Even officers of the law dined in their tavern, unaware or unwilling to see the truth under their feet. And why should they? The missing were black, poor, and voiceless. Society had already erased them. Patty Cannon simply exploited the vacuum that morality left behind. And when the cellars filled with too many prisoners to move, she chose the easiest form of efficiency. She killed them. For her, it wasn't murder. It was inventory management. And yet the question that echoes through the centuries is not how she did it, but how so many helped her do it. By 1815, the operation had outgrown its birthplace. What began as a tavern on a lonely border road had metastasized into a network, a secret economy fueled by lies, forged papers, and human agony. Patty Cannon, now in her late 40s, had become something more than a criminal. She was a symbol of what happens when morality dissolves under the weight of profit and power. Her gang stretched across Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, hunting not just enslaved runaways, but freeborn black men, women, and children. Those who had clawed their way out of bondage found themselves trapped again, this time by white neighbors who smiled by day and conspired by night. The gang scouts rode into towns like Easton, Dover, and Philadelphia, pretending to offer employment or safe passage south. But those who accepted were chained, gagged, and vanished, swallowed into the hidden tunnels beneath the Cannon property. To the authorities, her disappearances seemed like wanderings, a Negro who went missing, likely to seek work. no one cared enough to investigate. The cruelty wasn't a crime when the victims weren't seen as human. Patty's cruelty was cold, mathematical. She paid bounty hunters and boatmen on commission. She even employed children, white orphans, to spy and lure potential victims with promises of work. Every aspect of the network was a mechanism of control perfected over years, and through it all, she sat in that tavern chair like a matriarch of evil, commanding her people with the same authority she once used to manage a household. There are accounts, half myth, half memory, of how she handled overstock. When too many captives filled the cellar and prices dipped, she had them marched into the woods under the pretense of relocation. What happened next was never officially recorded, but decades later, farmers plowing the cannon fields unearthed the evidence: skulls, jawbones, broken shackles buried shallow in the clay. Each discovery confirmed what had long been whispered. The ground beneath her tavern wasn't soil. It was a cemetery. And through it all, she remained untouchable, shielded by race, gender, and fear. No one dared accuse her publicly. Even those who knew, neighbors, sheriffs, preachers, avoided her path. Because in that corner of Maryland, Patty Cannon wasn't just a woman. By the 1820s, the operation had grown bolder, more efficient, and more terrifying. Patty Cannon's network was no longer limited to wagons and backroads. She had learned the value of water, the power of tides, and the anonymity of the Delaware and Chesapeake bays. Coastal routes became her arteries, transporting stolen human lives to ports where buyers waited in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. The captives, men, women, and children, were blindfolded, chained, and crammed into wagons like cargo, then moved under the cover of night. Some were hidden in false-bottomed boats, ferried across marshes and rivers, and loaded onto legitimate merchant vessels. At sea, the law was nearly powerless. Once a victim crossed state lines, their identity could be erased entirely. They became invisible, deniable. Patty's genius was not just brutality, it was psychological. She understood terror as a tool. Captives were stripped of their names, their papers, anything that tethered them to freedom. Those who resisted were beaten, starved, or executed quietly in the woods. Fear itself became the currency of obedience. In her hands, the reverse Underground Railroad was more than a network of abduction. It was a system of control that broke the mind before it ever broke the body. Yet her operation was still hidden in plain sight. Locals saw the wagons, the passing sailors, the odd hours of Johnson's tavern, but most looked away. The world had been conditioned to ignore the suffering of African Americans. Patty exploited this indifference masterfully. And when whispers of her crimes began to reach Philadelphia and beyond, she didn't hide, she adapted, she diversified. New accomplices were recruited, white criminals to negotiate sales, mixed-race scouts to infiltrate free black communities, and coerced enslaved people who became unwilling participants in their own people's capture. Every detail was meticulously planned, every risk accounted for, every escape route covered. Her network was no longer a crime ring. It was a shadow government of fear, invisible yet omnipresent along the Delmarva Peninsula. She had turned geography, society, and law into tools of terror, and her empire would operate with impunity for years, until a chance discovery began to unravel it all. And now, listen closely, because what comes next shows the human cost in a way that records alone cannot capture. The first detailed testimonies of Patty Cannon's captives paint a portrait that words can barely hold. One of the earliest, Lydia Smith, was a free woman seized in 1825 while walking near Philadelphia. She was overpowered, gagged, and thrown into a wagon with dozens of others, blindfolded for days as they were transported to the Cannon homestead. The fear she described was constant, a living, suffocating presence that infiltrated every thought. The hidden rooms beneath the tavern were designed with precision. Low ceilings, iron rings bolted into stone walls, and narrow ventilation shafts that barely carried air. Hunger, cold, darkness, and the screams of others became the captives' only companions. Some women were forced into silence by the threat of death. Some children were so traumatized they forgot their own names. Patty Cannon had engineered a prison where identity itself could be stolen. But the cruelty extended beyond physical confinement. Psychological terror was as potent as the chains. Captives were stripped of their papers, their letters, their names, anything that tied them to a life outside her walls. They were told lies about the world beyond, about the hopelessness of escape, about the inevitability of Southern slavery. Resistance was met with beatings, humiliation, and in some cases execution. Every method was calculated to break the mind and cultivate compliance. And yet, what is truly haunting is the scale of indifference. Neighbors heard the wagons at night, saw strangers arriving and leaving, suspected something was amiss, but no one intervened. The law was weak, scattered, and often bribed. White society had little reason to protect those it already dehumanized. Petty exploited this epity ruthlessly. Her victims, though powerless, were witnesses to the machinery of evil. They saw the subtle orchestration of terror, the hierarchy of control, and the way fear could be weaponized as efficiently as a gun or a chain. Through these testimonies, history reveals not only her crimes, but her cunning, the way she manipulated space, law, and human psychology to dominate. By the time authorities began connecting the dots, Patty Cannon had already ensured that the reverse flow of freedom, the systematic enslavement of the free, was well underway. And in the minds of her captives, the lesson was clear. The world is blind, and power without conscience is unstoppable. The fields around the Cannon property began to reveal what the Cellars alone could not hide. Buried shallow beneath the clay were the bones of men, women, and children, remnants of those who had resisted or outlived their usefulness. A plow horse sinking into the earth would later expose these skeletons, but even before that, locals whispered of the smell, the strange disturbances in the soil, the oddness of the land itself. Patty Cannon's method was brutal but deliberate. She understood that murder was a tool, not passion, not revenge, but a calculated solution to maintain control. When captives could no longer be transported south, or when they threatened to expose the network, they were quietly killed. Some were shot, others beaten, some were left to die chained in hidden spaces. Each death was a statement. Resistance was futile. These killings were not random acts of violence. They were administrative decisions recorded in memory rather than in law. The tavern, the homestead, and the surrounding woods became a cemetery disguised as farmland. Each grave, each discarded body was a monument to the power she wielded and the fear she cultivated. And yet she remained untouchable. Even when bodies were discovered, witnesses were scarce, and the victims were mostly black. The courts, if they existed at all, treated their deaths as unfortunate accidents, their disappearances as inevitable misfortune. The system itself had failed them, creating an environment where someone like Patty Cannon could thrive unchecked. Her network extended further than most realized. Scouts tracked potential victims for months, learning families' routines, mapping the movements of free African Americans, and identifying the vulnerable. Wagons moved at night along hidden paths, through marshes and forests, carrying people who would vanish forever. Coastal routes allowed ships to transport captives south, bypassing any jurisdiction. The sheer audacity of her operation was unprecedented. It is here, in the shadows of her empire, that one sees the mechanics of control, fear, geography, corruption, and societal indifference woven together into a weaponized system. Patty Cannon did not merely kidnap. She engineered disappearance, turning law, distance, and human apathy into allies of her terror. And in the hearts of those who survived, a grim understanding settled. The world was not built to protect them. Power, unchecked and unscrupulous, could dominate completely, and the world would look the other way. Patty Cannon's empire was not built by her alone. She understood that control multiplies through collaboration, and she recruited a gang as diverse as it was cunning. White men handled negotiations and transport. Mixed-race scouts like John Purnell infiltrated free black communities with ease, moving unnoticed through both worlds. Even some enslaved individuals were coerced into service, forced to capture their own people under threat of death. Every member of her network became an extension of her will, an instrument of fear and precision. John Purnell, described in court records as a mulatto or yellow man, exemplified the brilliance of her strategy. He could present himself as a free black man seeking work or a light-skinned white trader, depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability allowed him to locate potential victims, gain their trust, and deliver them into Patty's hands without raising suspicion. He is a living tool of manipulation, a bridge between deception and terror. The gang operated like a well-oiled machine. Scouting reports detailed which families were financially vulnerable, which teenagers were susceptible to promises of employment, and which individuals could be intimidated or bribed. Wagons arrived and departed at odd hours, moving human cargo under blankets and chains. Coastal routes, river crossings, and even disguised merchant vessels carried captives to southern markets where the law was powerless to intervene. And yet, the psychological aspect was just as vital as logistics. Captives were constantly reminded of their helplessness, stripped of papers, beaten for resistance, forced into submission. By controlling not only their bodies but their identities and perceptions, Patty engineered total obedience. Fear became both a shield and a weapon. It protected her from scrutiny and enforced her dominance over the powerless. Local communities were complicit in subtle ways. Merchants supplied the gang without questions. Neighbors turned blind eyes. Even law enforcement, when it existed, was often bribed or overwhelmed. White society's indifference created a perfect camouflage for her crimes. This combination of diverse operatives, calculated fear, and societal complicity made Patty Cannon untouchable. She had transformed chaos into a system, brutality into strategy, and silence into power. Each abduction reinforced her empire, each disappearance expanded it, and each act of violence became a lesson in dominance, a warning to anyone who might defy her. By the mid-1820s, Patty Cannon's network had evolved from opportunistic abduction into a structured, almost corporate enterprise. Every detail was meticulously recorded, not on paper that could incriminate, but in the minds of her operatives. Who was captured, from which family, and how they would be transported south. What papers they carried, what lies would convince a southern buyer that they were legally enslaved, and what methods would ensure compliance during the journey. Every human being was cataloged, processed, and repurposed like merchandise. Captives were stripped of their names, documents, and history. Letters, freedom papers, and anything linking them to their communities were destroyed. They were given new identities, fabricated backstories, and falsified origins, transforming them into legitimate property for southern markets. Those who resisted, clung to their past, questioned their chains, were met with brutal enforcement, beatings, isolation, and sometimes death. Patty had perfected the art of psychological control, using fear to erase memory and loyalty to one's past. Joseph Johnson handled the outward-facing operations. He negotiated with buyers in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, ensuring the flow of human cargo remained steady and profitable. Wagons and boats were scheduled like clockwork, with contingencies for lawmen, storms, and suspicion. Scouts returned with intelligence on potential victims, detailing vulnerability in family structures, feeding a system that treated life as inventory. Patty's genius was her ability to weaponize legality and geography. By exploiting state borders and the indifference of local authorities, she created a gray zone where human life could be stolen with near impunity. Delaware lawmen had no jurisdiction in Maryland, and vice versa. Coastal routes allowed her to bypass land entirely, moving captives to ports where no one could trace their disappearance. The system was a machine of disappearance, one that thrived on society's blind spots. Yet the human toll was staggering. Men, women, and children suffered unimaginable conditions during transport, chained in wagons for days, blindfolded, hungry, and terrified. Some never survived the journey. Others were broken long before reaching the southern plantations. Patty Cannon's reverse underground railroad was not a rumor, nor an exaggeration. It was a psychological and logistical nightmare, a network where human misery became profit, fear became obedience, and identity became property. The empire she built operated quietly, invisibly, and ruthlessly, a dark mirror of the true Underground Railroad where freedom was stolen instead of granted. By the late 1820s, whispers of Patty Cannon's crimes began to reach the ears of those who could actually challenge her, lawmen, magistrates, and determined citizens in Philadelphia and beyond. Yet even then, the full scale of her empire remained shrouded in shadows. What little was known came through fragmented reports. A missing family here, a wagon full of abducted children there, a suspicious tavern that straddled state lines. The puzzle was incomplete, but the pattern was unmistakable. Investigators like Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker committed to protecting free African Americans, began tracing disappearances back to the Delmarva Peninsula. He and others quickly realized that Patty's operation was no ordinary criminal enterprise. It was systematic, bureaucratic, and sophisticated. Wagons arrived under cover of night, captives were moved silently, and the tavern served as a nexus for planning, supply, and concealment. Every piece of evidence that reached him hinted at a level of premeditation that was chilling. Patty's response to these threats was masterful. She did not panic, flee, or negotiate. Instead, she adapted her operation. Routes were altered, lookout systems improved, and accomplices were instructed to act with even greater secrecy. She leveraged geography to her advantage, ensuring that every escape or law enforcement attempt hit dead ends. Crossing a state line, a river, or a tidal marsh became a shield, and the complicity of local whites, merchants, neighbors, and lawmen became an invisible wall. Even when bodies were discovered in shallow graves or captives escaped to testify, Patty used fear as both armor and weapon. Witnesses disappeared, recanted, or were too terrified to speak. Families of the victims often had no legal standing, no influence, and no recourse. Every discovery, every attempt at prosecution only reinforced the sense that Patty Cannon was untouchable. Her empire of terror continued to operate in broad daylight, while her reputation grew into legend. Tales of her size, strength, and mercilessness circulated among both her victims and her peers. She had become more than a criminal. She was a force, a psychological dominator, who understood that fear, when combined with clever logistics and societal apathy, could render the law irrelevant. By now, one fact was undeniable. Patty Cannon had turned abduction, murder, and psychological manipulation into an institutionalized enterprise, a dark system that preyed on the powerless, weaponized fear, and remained nearly invisible to those who should have stopped it. Resistance was rare, but it existed, and Patty Cannon treated it with calculated cruelty. Captives who tried to escape, speak out, or defy her authority were met with punishment designed to break both body and mind. One young man, caught attempting to flee the tavern cellars, was chained to a stone wall for days, given only scraps of food, and told that no one would ever look for him. By the time he was released, his spirit had been shattered. Compliance had become instinct. Women were particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Many were told their children had been sold or killed if they disobeyed. They were forced to watch others punished, beaten, or even murdered to instill a constant, paralyzing fear. For Patty, cruelty was not sadism for its own sake. It was control. Every act of terror was strategic, designed to prevent escape, silence dissent, and maintain her grip over the network. Children, too, were instruments in her system. They were often separated from parents, indoctrinated into obedience, and threatened with death if they resisted. Their innocence became a weaponized vulnerability, shaping both their captives' behavior and the efficiency of her operations. Even among adults, the ever-present threat of disappearance, being buried in shallow graves or sent further south, maintained a level of terror that few could endure without submitting. Her methods were not haphazard. Patty Cannon had a remarkable understanding of human psychology for her time. She knew which threats would break people faster, which punishments would produce compliance without creating a riot, and how to maintain an aura of omnipotence. Rumors of her size, her strength, and her mercilessness were deliberately circulated, ensuring that even those who had never met her feared her. And yet, beneath this control lay a network of complicity. Scouting agents, neighbors, merchants, and corrupt lawmen all played a part in enforcing her dominance. Patty's genius was the orchestration of fear through both direct action and systemic indifference. Her victims were trapped not only by chains and walls, but by society itself, a society that had trained them to be invisible, expendable, and powerless. The horror of her empire was not only in the acts themselves, but in the realization that they were perfected over years, calculated and adaptive, and reinforced by a world willing to look the other way. Every act of terror, every captivity, every murder served the dual purpose of profit and control, an unholy equation she had mastered entirely. Even the most meticulous empires eventually leave traces, and by the late 1820s, Patty Cannon's network began to show cracks. Whispers reached Philadelphia, Baltimore, and beyond, tales of wagons disappearing in the night, coastal shipments arriving without manifests, and families suddenly vanished. Authorities, long indifferent to the disappearances of free African Americans, could no longer ignore the growing pattern. Mayor Joseph Watson and a handful of dedicated investigators began mapping the web of terror. They traced routes, noted unusual tavern activity, and compiled reports from escaped captives. Each account was harrowing. Men chained together in hidden rooms, women forced into compliance through fear of family separation, children stripped of their names. The system was immense, sophisticated, and horrifying, but vulnerable. Networks as reliant on secrecy as Patty's always were. Im Lus en Kult unraffel erwerting. Meanwhile, inside the tavern, Patty's empire still operated with terrifying efficiency. Wagons continued to roll under cover of darkness, captives were transported to the coast, and southern buyers awaited their human cargo. Yet the walls that once insulated her were now under scrutiny. Lawmen patrolled the borders, neighbors whispered suspiciously, and even some accomplices began to fear the consequences of discovery. Patty, however, remained calculating and adaptable. She altered routes, intensified surveillance, and ensured her accomplices knew the stakes. Fear continued to govern both her captives and her own network, but now it had a new target, the investigators attempting to dismantle her empire. She understood that reputation, terror, and loyalty were her most potent defenses. One misstep could expose the tunnels, the hidden cellars, and the graves. Crucially, the first testimonies from escaped captives began to provide a blueprint for authorities. They described hidden rooms beneath the tavern, the methods used to strip people of their identities, and the routes taken to transport victims south. Each story added clarity to a picture that had once been nearly impossible to comprehend. The stage was set for confrontation. Patty Cannon's empire, built on fear, geography, and societal indifference, was beginning to face the relentless pressure of investigation. Yet the most chilling aspect remained. She had engineered her terror with such precision that even now, many doubted that justice could ever truly reach her. The first freed captives began to speak, and their accounts pierced the veil of Patty Cannon's empire like a knife. One young woman described the moment she realized escape was possible, but terrifying. She had spent months blindfolded, chained, stripped of her identity, forced to watch others broken by fear. Every day was a lesson in obedience, every act of cruelty a demonstration that resistance meant death. Er nasa so vivor récolte hidden Cellars Bennet Johnson's tavern. Men, women, and children crowded together in darkness, their chains clinking in unison. The air was thick with the stench of fear, human waste, and despair. They were starved, forced to sleep on bare floors, and punished for the smallest signs of rebellion. Patty's methods were precise. Beatings were calibrated to enforce compliance, isolation used to destroy morale, and threats of death made palpable through the nearby graves that held those who had failed. These testimonies revealed a startling reality. The reverse Underground Railroad was not just a kidnapping operation. It was a psychological machine. Captives were stripped of identity, memory, and hope. Their names were erased, their pasts obliterated, and their sense of self replaced with fear-driven obedience. Patty had perfected a system where terror itself became a weapon as effective as chains, doors, or guns. The survivors' accounts also exposed the network's logistics. Wagons moved under cover of darkness, rivers and coastal routes carried captives to southern buyers, and accomplices scouted potential victims months in advance. Names, papers, and personal effects were destroyed or falsified to make each person legally invisible. The system was meticulous, a fusion of brute force, cunning, and bureaucratic manipulation. But the psychological horror extended beyond captivity. Survivors recounted the constant uncertainty. Would they be sold south tomorrow? Would the family survive? Could they ever reclaim their identities? Every detail was engineered to instill helplessness. Patty Cannon understood that breaking the mind was as crucial as breaking the body. By the time investigators compiled these testimonies, the full scope of her operation became horrifyingly clear. The network was vast, the methods cruelly efficient, and the system sustained not only by physical domination, but by a society willing to turn a blind eye. Patty Cannon's terror was a lesson in how power, fear, and apathy could converge into a machine of systematic destruction. Geography was Patty Cannon's silent ally. The Delmarva Peninsula, a tangle of forests, marshes, and rivers, became the perfect theater for her empire of terror. Roads were little more than dirt paths, winding and isolated, allowing wagons carrying captives to slip through unnoticed. The dense pine and oak forests offered cover for movement, ambushes, and even shallow graves, hiding the evidence of crimes in plain sight. Rivers and creeks functioned as hidden highways. Small boats could ferry captives south under the cover of night, avoiding the scattered law enforcement of the era. By combining waterways with concealed routes across county and state lines, Patty transformed the landscape into a trap disguised as a road to freedom. She understood that the natural world itself could be weaponized to reinforce fear and maintain control. State borders amplified her advantage. Her homestead and Johnson's Tavern sat precisely on the Delaware-Maryland line. When Delaware authorities sought to intervene, accomplices could simply cross into Maryland. The law was fragmented, jurisdictional disputes were rampant, and Patty used these loopholes as shields. Each boundary became a tool of evasion, each jurisdiction a layer of protection for her crimes. Even the isolation of local communities worked in her favor. Sparse white populations meant few witnesses, and transient neighbors rarely noticed or reported suspicious activity. The few who did suspect something often chose indifference, complicity by apathy. Merchants sold supplies with asking questions. Local lawmen could be bribed or ignored the disappearances of African Americans entirely. The world beyond her control was blind, indifferent, and manipulable. This terrain, both physical and societal, was engineered into her operation. Every abduction, every transport, every concealment relied on a precise understanding of land, law, and human behavior. Rivers, forests, roads, and borders were more than geography. They were instruments of fear, confinement, and control. Her captives, chained and blindfolded, had no sense of direction or hope. Every obstacle became an invisible wall reinforcing her dominance. By mastering geography as strategy, Patty Cannon turned a simple plot of land into an almost impenetrable fortress. Law, morality, and humanity itself could not touch her, and in this landscape, terror became tangible, a force as real as the chains and as omnipresent as the forest that hid them. Patty Cannon's network did not end at the Delaware Peninsula. It stretched like a shadowy web into the deep south, connecting to buyers hungry for labor in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Each captive she seized became a commodity, cataloged and prepared for transport with the same meticulous attention as merchandise on a ledger. This was a reverse Underground Railroad, freedom stolen, identities erased, and lives sold into permanent bondage. The southern markets were booming. Cotton plantations demanded labor, and the ban on imported African slaves in 1808 had created a desperate, lucrative domestic market. Healthy adults fetched high prices. Children, molded for obedience, promised decades of profit. Patty's operation capitalized on this demand, turning kidnapping into a multi-state enterprise. Southern buyers didn't ask questions. They accepted the false identities and documents her network provided, unaware or indifferent to the trauma hidden behind their new property. Transport was both art and cruelty. Captives were chained in wagons or boats, blindfolded and moved under cover of darkness. Routes were carefully chosen to avoid towns, patrols, and anyone who might intervene. When delays occurred, captives were confined in hidden rooms, cellars, or makeshift holding pens, reinforcing their sense of helplessness. Psychological manipulation accompanied physical restraint, whispers of family deaths, threats of worse fates, and relentless uncertainty. Fear became a tool as precise as a scalpel, cutting away hope and replacing it with obedience. Patty's southern connections were key. She maintained discreet alliances with traders, tavern owners, and transporters, ensuring that each captive could be sold swiftly and efficiently. The network relied on mutual benefit and secrecy. Each participant had something to gain, money, loyalty, or survival, and something to lose if the system failed. This web of complicity extended her influence far beyond the borderlands, making her empire effectively untouchable. For the captives, the journey south was a descent into darkness. Families were broken, identities erased, and futures stolen. For Patty Cannon and her accomplices, it was a calculated, profitable enterprise, a system that thrived on human misery, fear, and the indifference of a society unwilling to protect its most vulnerable. The terror she wielded was not chaotic. It was systematic, sustained, and merciless. Patty Cannon had engineered a machine of control that stretched hundreds of miles, binding people through fear, geography, and legal loopholes. And yet, despite the scale of her crimes, the world remained largely unaware, and the captives' voices struggled to reach those who might save them. Even the most meticulously controlled empires have cracks, and Patty Cannon's was no exception. Some captives managed to escape, by chance, courage, or the rare assistance of sympathetic outsiders. Each escape sent ripples through her network, a reminder that no system, no matter how brutal or well-organized, is infallible. One woman, Lydia Smith, became a symbol of resistance. Kidnapped in 1825, she endured months chained in hidden cellars beneath Johnson's Tavern, witnessing the constant terror inflicted on those around her. Yet she survived, observing the patterns, memorizing the routes, and seizing a moment of opportunity. Her eventual rescue by Joseph Watson's network exposed the inner workings of the reverse Underground Railroad, revealing the tunnels, hidden rooms, and the terrifying logistics of Patty Cannon's operation. Escapes were dangerous, both physically and psychologically. Captives had to move through forests, rivers, and marshlands while avoiding patrols, accomplices, and the constant fear that their families would be punished in retaliation. Many were recaptured, and the consequences were brutal: beatings, humiliation, or worse. For those who made it to safety, the trauma was deep and lasting, but their testimony became invaluable, illuminating a system that had seemed untouchable. These escapes also exposed the vulnerabilities of the empire itself. Routes were mapped, contacts identified, and the complicity of some accomplices revealed. Investigators began to understand that Patty's power relied not just on terror, but on secrecy, isolation, and societal apathy. Remove one of these elements, and the structure could begin to collapse. Yet, even as cracks appeared, Patty Cannon adapted. She altered transport routes, increased surveillance, and implemented new punishments to maintain control. Her empire was resilient because it was not merely built on fear, it was engineered with redundancy, contingency, and ruthless intelligence. Each escape became a lesson in tightening control, a grim calculus of human suffering and operational efficiency. The Survivors' testimonies, the investigative breakthroughs, and the rare escapes mark at the beginning of the Anpia's unraveling. But they also revealed the extraordinary depths of her cruelty and cunning. Patty Cannon had not just kidnapped. She had constructed a machine of fear, logistics, and psychological domination, a system that operated in plain sight yet remained almost invisible, until the first sparks of exposure began to glow. By the late 1820s, the pressure on Patty Cannon's network became relentless. Investigators like Joseph Watson and determined lawmen began connecting the scattered reports, tracing abductions from Philadelphia and Wilmington to the Delmarva Peninsula. The testimonies of survivors, once fragmented whispers, now formed a map, a blueprint of terror that threatened to dismantle her carefully constructed empire. Authorities made their first serious moves. Warrants were issued, accomplices were questioned, and surveillance intensified around Johnson's Tavern. The border-straddling tavern, once a fortress of impunity, became a focal point. For the first time, the consequences of her actions seemed real, tangible, and imminent. But Patty, ever the strategist, did not falter. She had anticipated confrontation and designed her operation to endure scrutiny. Jurisdictional gaps, loyal accomplices, and the isolation of the region allowed her to continue functioning while investigators struggled to coordinate across state lines. Her first arrest shook her network. Minor accomplices were captured, some forced to testify under threat of execution. Yet Patty herself remained elusive, a shadow orchestrating terror from behind the scenes. Her influence over her captives ensured silence. Fear overpowered loyalty to law. Witnesses who might have exposed her were intimidated, disappearing quietly or suffering brutal reprisals. Her psychological mastery allowed her to maintain dominance even as the law closed in. Still, cracks were appearing. Survivors' accounts revealed hidden rooms, secret cellars, and the precise logistics of abductions. Authorities began plotting strategies to intercept wagons, track southern shipments, and disrupt the network. Each small victory emboldened lawmen and terrified Patty's operatives, forcing the gang to adapt quickly or face exposure. What emerges in this phase is a chilling lesson in the duality of terror and cunning. Patty Cannon's strength lay not only in physical intimidation, but in foresight, planning, and the exploitation of societal weakness. She had built an empire on fear, geography, and systemic indifference. Now, for the first time, that empire faced an opponent capable of challenging all three pillars. The tension mounted. Every action, every decision carried stakes measured in lives, liberty, and freedom. The empire of the reverse Underground Railroad, once seemingly untouchable, had finally drawn the gaze of relentless pursuit. And yet Patty Cannon remained unbroken, a dark, commanding force in a world beginning to notice the invisible terror she had wrought. The first raids on Patty Cannon's territory brought the unimaginable into the light. Lawmen, guided by survivor testimonies and tireless investigation, descended on Johnson's Tavern and surrounding properties. What they found was more horrifying than any rumor or whisper tale. Hidden cellars, secret chambers, and shallow graves, the silent witnesses of decades of abductions and murders. The discovery of bodies, and some of them children, sent shockwaves through the community. These were not isolated crimes. They were systematic, calculated, and industrial in their cruelty. Each grave, each hidden room, revealed a layer of terror meticulously engineered by Patty Cannon. Investigators began to grasp the true scale of her enterprise, an empire built on chains, fear, and the erasure of identity. Survivors guided authorities through the dark corridors beneath the tavern. They described a constant smell of damp, the sound of chains clinking, and the suffocating sense of hopelessness. Men, women, and children were packed tightly together, their identities stripped, their futures sold into bondage. The psychological manipulation was as thorough as the physical confinement. Captives were broken, reshaped, and made to comply through terror alone. As investigators documented the horrors, the full extent of the network's reach became apparent. Patty Cannon had built connections from Delaware to the Deep South, moving captives along secret routes, supplying Southern buyers with human cargo, and exploiting legal loopholes and apathy along the way. The raids exposed not only her brutality, but also the complicity of a society that had enabled her. Neighbors, merchants, and lawmen who had turned blind eyes or actively assisted in her crimes. Yet Patty herself remained elusive, a ghost orchestrating the chaos from the shadows. The raids shook her network, but fear and loyalty still bound her accomplices. She adapted quickly, relocating operations, changing routes, and ensuring that her captives remained compliant. Even in the face of exposure, her intelligence and ruthlessness allowed the Empire to endure. The first raids were a pivotal moment, a confrontation between law and terror, light and darkness. The horror was undeniable, the cruelty visible, and the stakes unmistakable. Patty Cannon's world of abduction, murder, and psychological domination had been revealed, but she was not yet finished. Her empire had survived scrutiny before, and now it would test the limits of the law, the courage of survivors, and the persistence of justice itself. As news of the raid spread, public outrage ignited like wildfire. Newspapers chronicled the horrors discovered at Johnson's Tavern, the hidden cellars, the shallow graves, and the testimonies of survivors. Communities, long indifferent to the disappearances of African Americans, were finally forced to confront the monstrous reality of Patty Cannon's empire. Fear and fascination merged. The story gripped the region, making her name synonymous with terror. Law enforcement intensified the chase. Multiple jurisdictions, previously fragmented and exploited by Cannon, now coordinated in unprecedented ways. Warrants were issued across state lines, patrols were increased, and investigations focused not just on minor accomplices, but on the elusive mastermind herself. Yet Patty remained a ghost. She had mastered evasion, using geography, loyalty, and deception to slip past authorities. Every raid that disrupted her operations was met with a swift adaptation, new routes, relocated captives, and reinforced secrecy. Her psychological cunning was unparalleled. Even under the growing scrutiny, her reputation as a figure of brute force and omnipresent threat maintained obedience among her remaining captives and accomplices. Threats, intimidation, and fear ensured silence. Few dared speak against her, and those who did risked death. The combination of terror and strategy made her a nearly untouchable force. Lawmen could investigate, but capturing her required outthinking a mind that had spent decades perfecting manipulation and control. Meanwhile, public outrage began to shape political pressure. Citizens demanded justice, newspapers painted vivid portraits of horror, and law enforcement faced increasing scrutiny for any failures to act. The duality of her empire became clear. She had exploited societal apathy for decades, but now the very society that had shielded her began to turn its gaze in alarmed moral judgment. Patty Cannon's brilliance lay in her ability to survive in the cracks of society. She had weaponized geography, fear, and legal ambiguity, creating a network that seemed immune to discovery. Yet, as raids multiplied and witnesses provided testimony, the Empire's foundations began to tremble. The chase was no longer just law versus criminal. It had become a psychological battle of wits, strategy, and endurance, testing the limits of both her cunning and the persistence of justice. In the shadows of this pursuit, one fact remained terrifyingly clear. Patty Cannon's empire had thrived not simply because of cruelty, but because she understood human nature, fear, loyalty, and the instinct for self-preservation, and had bent them all to her will. The first cracks in Patty Cannon's network began to widen with the capture of key accomplices. Men and women who had once acted as extensions of her will were now cornered, interrogated, and forced to reveal the mechanisms of the empire. Each confession exposed the logistical precision of abductions, the hidden routes through forests and marshes, and the underground cellars where captives were held. What had been whispered terror became tangible, a map of cruelty and control. These arrests sent shockwaves through her operation. Wagons that had once moved silently under cover of darkness were now intercepted. Southern buyers, previously confident in the supply of property, began to hesitate as law enforcement followed the routes laid bare by accomplice testimony. The empire, built on secrecy, loyalty, and fear, was beginning to unravel because the very human instruments of obedience could be broken. Patty Cannon herself remained elusive. She had anticipated this moment and had contingency plans, relocated safe houses, alternative routes, and loyal lieutenants ready to step in. Even as authorities dismantled the fringes of her network, she adapted. Her genius lay not only in cruelty, but in foresight. Every contingency of capture, betrayal, or exposure had been considered and countered. The interrogations revealed the sheer scale of terror she had orchestrated. Captives were catalogued, identities erased, and transportation scheduled with military-like efficiency. Money exchanged hands, papers were falsified, and accomplices were deployed with precision across states. The survivors' testimonies, now corroborated by captured accomplices, gave investigators a horrifyingly clear picture of her empire. Each revelation confirmed that this was not a series of opportunistic crimes. It was a systematic, deliberate, and brutal enterprise designed to exploit fear and societal blind spots. Public awareness grew with every confession. Newspapers recounted details that seemed almost mythical: chains in hidden cellars, captives transported over rivers and through marshes, bodies buried in shallow graves. The stories ignited outrage, fear, and fascination. And yet, despite the collapsing network, Patty remained a shadow, unseen, untouchable, and relentless. Her empire's unraveling demonstrated a profound truth. Even the most powerful systems of control are vulnerable when human loyalty is tested, when secrecy fails, and when justice begins to move with relentless focus. But within that unraveling, Patty Cannon's intelligence, adaptability, and ruthless will remained a force to be reckoned with, even as the law closed in around her. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered horrors that transcended even the darkest rumors. Hidden cellars were far more elaborate than anyone had imagined. Some rooms were partitioned to separate men, women, and children, while chains and iron rings anchored captives to walls. Ventilation shafts allowed the air to circulate just enough to prevent suffocation, but not enough to ease their suffering. Every detail of these spaces spoke to a meticulous, premeditated system of psychological torture, as much as physical imprisonment. Survivors described a relentless cycle of terror. Captives were stripped of names, papers, and personal belongings, replaced with identities constructed to support the Southern slave trade. Those who resisted or attempted to remember their past were beaten until compliance returned. Hunger, isolation, and fear were constant tools, carefully calibrated to erode hope. Patty Cannon understood that breaking the mind was as essential as breaking the body. By the time captives were transported south, many no longer recognized themselves, their spirits reshaped into obedience. Investigators also uncovered the methods she used to manipulate accomplices. Loyalty was maintained through fear, rewards, and shared culpability. Some accomplices were blackmailed, their own crimes used as chains to ensure compliance. Others were enticed by wealth, the promise of profit making them willing participants in atrocities. The network operated as a psychological ecosystem, where each person's survival depended on their obedience to her strategy, and betrayal could mean death. The scope of the operation became undeniable. Patty Cannon's influence reached hundreds of miles: abductions in Pennsylvania, movements through Delaware and Maryland, and sales into Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. Every success relied on precision and planning. Each captive was an object of commerce, but also a tool to reinforce her power. The psychological weight she imposed, terror, helplessness, and constant threat, ensured that the network remained functional even as law enforcement closed in. For the investigators, the revelations were overwhelming. They now faced the grim truth that this was not a criminal enterprise of isolated acts, but a systematic, multi-state machine of terror perfectly adapted to exploit the vulnerabilities of law, geography, and society's blind indifference. Patty Cannon had not simply captured people. She had constructed a world where fear itself maintained control. The chilling realization settled over everyone involved. The empire was built with intention, intelligence, and a level of cruelty that defied comprehension. And yet, for all the horrors revealed, the mastermind herself remained a phantom, always a step ahead, always untouchable, her presence a looming shadow over every discovery. Patty Cannon's empire thrived not only because of her cunning, but because society itself enabled her. The political and social structures of the early 19th century were riddled with loopholes, biases, and systemic indifference that she exploited with ruthless precision. Law enforcement was fragmented, underfunded, and often corrupt. Jurisdictional disputes between Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania meant that criminals could slip across borders and escape prosecution with ease. Boundaries were shields, not lines of justice. Society's moral blindness played a crucial role. The disappearances of free African Americans drew little attention because their lives were undervalued by the dominant culture. Newspapers rarely reported on them, local authorities often ignored complaints, and the broader public assumed their fates were unremarkable. The combination of racial prejudice and societal indifference created a fertile ground for her crimes to flourish. Each abduction relied as much on fear as on this structural negligence, a reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, protected by the apathy of the majority. Even in the face of growing evidence, political forces moved cautiously. Local officials worried about public scandal, while state authorities hesitated to challenge jurisdictional complexities. Corruption seeped through the system. Some lawmen were bribed, others simply turned a blind eye, and merchants profited from supplying her operations. It was a network of complicity extending far beyond her immediate circle, one that allowed terror to continue for nearly 2 decades. Petty Untersturzes. She knew that law and morality were not absolute barriers, they were malleable, bendable tools in the hands of someone bold enough to exploit them. By carefully studying the limits of enforcement, she could operate in a gray zone where fear, secrecy, and strategic positioning kept her untouchable. Every abduction, every hidden room, every carefully timed transport was not only a crime but a calculated test of the system's weaknesses. The empire she built was more than a criminal enterprise. It was a mirror reflecting the failures of society itself. It exposed the gaps in law, the biases of enforcement, and the moral compromises that allowed such evil to endure. Her success was a dark lesson. True power lies not only in brute force or terror, but in the ability to exploit the flaws of institutions, turning society's weaknesses into weapons. For those who observed, it was a horrifying realization. Patty Cannon had not only dominated her victims, but had outmaneuvered the structures designed to protect them. The question lingered like a shadow. How many others could operate in silence, shielded by the blind spots of society, waiting for someone to notice? To understand Patty Cannon, one must look beyond the crimes and see the mind that orchestrated them. She was not a monster born overnight, but a product of circumstance, cunning, and calculated cruelty. Descriptions from neighbors depict a woman physically imposing, nearly 6 feet tall, commanding in presence, with a voice that could intimidate entire rooms. But her power extended far beyond muscle. It was psychological, strategic, and terrifyingly precise. Her ruthlessness was honed over decades. Early life details are murky, yet what is clear is her relentless understanding of human behavior. She knew fear, loyalty, and desperation were levers she could manipulate. Captives were broken not merely through chains, but through systematic psychological domination, isolation, threat of violence, hunger, and erasure of identity. Each act reinforced the perception of inevitability, making compliance not just safer, but seemingly the only option. Patty's relationships with accomplices mirrored her manipulation of captives. Loyalty was extracted through intimidation, shared culpability, and financial reward. She fostered dependency, creating a network that could execute complex operations with efficiency while remaining under her absolute control. Betrayal was punished swiftly and ruthlessly, reinforcing the fear that bound her empire together. Every member understood survival depended on obedience, and defiance meant death. Her intelligence manifested in foresight and adaptability. She anticipated raids, manipulated jurisdictional loopholes, and redesigned operations in response to scrutiny. Where others saw obstacles, she saw opportunity. Every lawman's move, every witness testimony, every escape attempt was incorporated into her evolving strategy. Her empire was not static. It was a living, adaptive organism sustained by fear, cunning, and meticulous planning. Psychologically, she thrived in control. The abduction, manipulation, and eventual sale of human beings were not crimes of impulse, but deliberate exercises in power and dominion. Each captive was both a resource and a reflection of her authority. Her ability to project absolute control over life and death made her not only feared, but virtually untouchable for years. Patty Cannon was a master of shadows, a woman whose intelligence, foresight, and psychological insight allowed her to build an empire that exploited fear, law, and societal blindness. To study her is to confront an unsettling truth. True power, when combined with ruthless intelligence and moral vacancy, can operate almost entirely beyond the reach of justice. Patty Cannon's network cast a long, dark shadow over the efforts of those fighting for freedom. While the Underground Railroad was quietly moving escaped enslaved people northward to safety, her reverse Underground Railroad operated in mirror image, snatching free African Americans and escapees, dragging them back into the chains they had fought to leave behind. It was a grim demonstration of the fragility of freedom, a reminder that liberty, once won, could still be stolen with brutality, cunning, and impunity. Her operations directly undermined the moral and logistical work of abolitionists. Safe houses became vulnerable, routes were monitored, and trust was a fragile commodity. The mere presence of her network forced those aiding fugitives to calculate risk with lethal precision. Every successful abduction was not only a triumph for Cannon, but a blow to the ideals of freedom and justice that her victims represented. The psychological warfare was immense. Fear traveled faster than whispers, leaving communities in tension and constant vigilance. What made her system particularly terrifying was its sophistication. Cannon and her accomplices didn't merely kidnap randomly. They gathered intelligence, studied families, and identified vulnerabilities. They exploited gaps in the law, community apathy, and the inability of authorities to protect African Americans. Each victim was chosen deliberately, ensuring maximum profit, minimal risk, and maximum disruption of freedom networks. In doing so, Cannon highlighted a terrifying reality. Freedom is not guaranteed, and the structures meant to protect it can be manipulated and corrupted. This shadow struggle between liberty and tyranny exposed a broader societal tension. Cannon's enterprise thrived precisely because societal structures devalued certain lives. Law enforcement, merchants, and local communities either turned a blind eye or actively facilitated her work. Meanwhile, abolitionists and escape networks were forced to adapt, moving in secret, constantly recalibrating strategies, and sometimes witnessing the tragic failure of their efforts. Her empire was a dark counterpoint, a mirror reflecting the persistent vulnerabilities in society's moral and legal fabric. Even in history, the duality remains stark. The heroism of the Underground Railroad is celebrated, yet the fear, loss, and terror inflicted by the reverse Underground Railroad lingered invisibly, almost erased. Patty Cannon's network was not only a criminal enterprise, it was a psychological and societal challenge, proving how darkness can exploit light, and how freedom is never truly secure without vigilance, courage, and sacrifice. The final years of Patty Cannon were a study in inevitability. No empire, no matter how cunningly constructed, can withstand relentless pressure forever. The net of law, once slow and fragmented, had tightened. Witnesses were willing to speak, accomplices were captured, and every hidden route, cellar, and safe house had been partially exposed. Her shadowed reign, which had terrorized the Delmarva Peninsula for decades, was coming to its inexorable conclusion. Cannon was finally arrested, removed from the isolation that had shielded her for so long. Reports describe her as still imposing, her presence commanding even behind bars, her mind alert, calculating, always evaluating her surroundings. Yet for the first time, she was constrained, her mobility and control stripped away. The world she had ruled through fear and cunning now existed beyond her reach, and she would have to face the consequences of her decades of terror. Prison was not only a physical confinement, but a psychological confrontation. For the first time, Cannon was exposed to the cumulative weight of her crimes, survivor testimonies, detailed reports from accomplices, and the scrutiny of law enforcement that no bribe, threat, or manipulation could escape. The very fear that had protected her empire now served as a reminder of its fragility. Every secret revealed, every escape route blocked, demonstrated that her mastery over others could not protect her from justice. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was filled with a public hungry to see the end of a legend of terror. Witnesses recounted her abductions, murders, and psychological manipulations. They detailed hidden rooms, chained captives, and the meticulous operations she had orchestrated across multiple states. The horror was amplified by the realization that her crimes had been sustained for decades, allowed to flourish by societal indifference and the weaknesses of fragmented law enforcement. Each story, each detail, painted a portrait of genius intertwined with ruthless immorality. In the end, Patty Cannon's reign concluded not with a dramatic escape or final act of defiance, but with containment and accountability. The empire of fear she had built crumbled, her accomplices either dead, imprisoned, or exposed, and the communities she had terrorized slowly began to recover. Yet her story did not vanish. The legend of her cruelty, intelligence, and the terror she wielded persisted, a reminder that evil can thrive where vigilance falters and morality is ignored. The psychological aftermath of Patty Cannon's reign of terror extended far beyond her imprisonment. So vivos sporschkas invisible to the eye once carved into memory, identity, and trust. Years in dark, confined cellars, stripped of names, chains biting flesh, and constant fear had left them fractured. Many struggled to reclaim their sense of self, haunted by the knowledge that freedom could be stolen again, that the world they returned to had failed to protect them. Communities, too, felt the lingering weight of her empire. Families who had lost children or relatives to her kidnappings carried the trauma silently. Local populations, long complicit or indifferent, were confronted with a moral reckoning. Questions arose: how had such atrocities gone unnoticed? How had society allowed fear, prejudice, and corruption to sustain a network of terror for decades? The psychological imprint was both collective and personal, a deep fissure in the consciousness of the region. Her network's ripple effects extended into the Underground Railroad as well. Abolitionists had to adapt to a new, darker reality. Freedom was fragile, and those working to secure it were not only contending with law and geography, but with a human intelligence willing to exploit every weakness. Trust had to be recalibrated, routes adjusted, and vigilance heightened. The terror Cannon inflicted created a shadow world of fear and strategy, forcing a generation of freedom fighters to operate in constant tension between hope and danger. Historians note that her crimes exposed the vulnerabilities of systems meant to protect citizens. Weak jurisdictional enforcement, corrupt officials, and societal indifference had allowed her to operate virtually unchecked. The moral lessons lingered, evil could thrive in silence, and societal blind spots were as dangerous as physical chains. Her empire was a masterclass in exploitation of human and institutional weakness, showing that the most enduring threats are often those hidden in plain sight. Even decades later, the story of Patty Cannon persisted as a cautionary tale. It was a reminder that terror does not always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes it emerges from within communities, exploiting fear, prejudice, and indifference. Her psychological legacy and the societal lessons it exposed would echo long after her death, a stark warning that vigilance, moral courage, and awareness are the only safeguards against those who would exploit the shadows to dominate others. In the years following Patty Cannon's capture and death, her story transformed from historical record into legend and then into myth. Communities whispered about the woman who had walked among them, seemingly ordinary, yet capable of orchestrating unimaginable terror. Her name became synonymous with fear, her deeds exaggerated and reframed as morality tales, cautionary warnings, and ghost stories whispered in the dead of night. Others amplified her persona. Some claim she could sense fear in people, like a predator reading the rhythm of a heartbeat before striking. Others spoke of secret tunnels stretching for miles, hidden compartments under every floorboard, and graves so cleverly concealed they were never found. Her image evolved into a figure larger than life, part criminal mastermind, part phantom terror, a symbol of evil's capacity to hide in plain sight. These stories were not merely entertainment, they were the collective processing of trauma. Communities attempted to make sense of horrors that had seemed incomprehensible, and mythology became a way to impose narrative control on chaos. Folklore served another purpose. It perpetuated her lessons. Parents warned children to be wary of strangers, of overly friendly neighbors, and of appearances that hid danger. Hunters, travelers, and small-town residents all carried a shadowed caution in their hearts. The line between history and legend blurred, but the essence remained. Patty Cannon was a master of fear, and fear could protect or destroy depending on the circumstances. Her myth also highlighted the societal complicity that had enabled her reign. By mythologizing her, communities acknowledged the depth of systemic failures, the indifference, prejudice, and corruption that had allowed her empire to thrive. Legends reminded everyone that the shadows are never empty. They are inhabited by those who understand the weakness of law, society, and human trust. Even now, over 200 years later, the story of Patty Cannon endures. She is remembered not merely as a criminal, but as a symbol of the darkness lurking in human ambition, of the exploitation of fear, and of the fragile barrier between freedom and captivity. The mythology around her keeps alive a warning that resonates universally. Intelligence and ruthlessness, unchecked by morality, can create terror that echoes far beyond the physical crimes themselves. Patty Cannon's story, terrifying as it is, contains lessons that extend beyond history, reaching into the very mechanics of power, strategy, and human behavior. Her mastery lay not merely in brute force or criminal audacity, but in her understanding of control over people, systems, and perception. Every kidnapping, every hidden room, every manipulated accomplice was a calculated move in a complex game of dominance. For the modern observer, there is a dark brilliance in her methods, a cold psychology that reveals how influence and fear can be weaponized. She understood leverage in its purest form. Vulnerability, whether of captives, neighbors, or corrupt officials, became her currency. She exploited weaknesses, social, legal, and emotional, converting gaps in the system into profit and security. Her empire demonstrates a principle few want to acknowledge. Systems, however robust they seem, are only as strong as their blind spots allow. A single mind with intelligence and ruthlessness can manipulate these weaknesses to astounding effect. Fear was her tool, obedience her currency. Patty Cannon's captives complied not only because of chains, but because she had made every person around her believe resistance was futile. Loyalty among accomplices was enforced not just through reward, but through shared culpability and the implicit threat of exposure. Every action was a lesson in psychological domination, a blueprint of control rooted in observation, calculation, and audacity. The story is also a cautionary tale. Power without ethics corrodes everything it touches. Cannon's brilliance was inseparable from cruelty. Her strategy was inseparable from terror. The genius of her operations lay not in benevolence, but in the cold calculus of self-interest and dominance. And yet, despite decades of cunning, the relentless pursuit of accountability through survivors, law enforcement, and societal pressure eventually dismantled her empire. Even the most formidable manipulator cannot escape the long arc of consequence. For the modern man, there is a paradoxical insight. Understanding power, fear, and strategic manipulation can illuminate the mechanics of influence in life, business, and society. But to wield these tools ethically is the true mastery. Petty can master the machinery of control, and the runet leaves behind. We arrive at the final reflection, but the story of Patty Cannon is not neatly concluded. Her death, imprisonment, and the collapse of her empire did not erase the lessons embedded in her life. The shadows she cast lingered in the memories of survivors, in the folklore whispered through generations, and in the dark truths about human nature that her life exposed. She was a mirror, showing what happens when intelligence, ruthlessness, and fear converge unchecked. Her tale forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. Evil does not always announce itself. It thrives in silence, in blind spots, in societal indifference. It exploits gaps in law, gaps in morality, and the vulnerabilities of those too trusting or too distracted to see it coming. Cannon's victims were often invisible to the system, free African Americans whose disappearances sparked little notice. Yet her audacity reveals a universal truth. Power, once understood and wielded, can dominate even when the world believes it is safe. The psychological mastery she employed, her use of fear, observation, and manipulation resonates beyond her crimes. It is a study in human behavior, a dark blueprint of control that exposes how systems and people can be coerced, deceived, or dominated. Her empire collapsed, yes, but only after decades of terror, exploitation, and cunning. The lesson is chilling. Vigilance is never optional. Freedom, security, and morality require constant attention, or they will be stolen piece by piece. Her legend endures because it speaks to the duality of human nature. We are capable of heroism and cruelty, ingenuity and devastation, insight and destruction. Patty Cannon's life is a warning. The same intelligence and strategy that can build empires can also enslave, destroy, and terrify. History remembers her not only for her crimes, but for the truths her life forces us to face. Truths about fear, morality, and the fragile architecture of freedom. And now, as you sit with these revelations, consider your own vigilance. Consider how easily systems, communities, and even individuals can be manipulated by those who understand fear, leverage, and human weakness. Remember the captives in her cellars, the complicity of society, the unchecked audacity of a single mind. History, in this case, is a mirror, and Patty Cannon's reflection is stark, unyielding, and unforgettable. It is a reminder that darkness is never far, that freedom is never guaranteed, and that the price of awareness is eternal vigilance.